Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the two officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these two officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the two police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these two officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the two officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the two police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave, and so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch. And then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked. But it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 ghost crash. Early on the afternoon of October 12, 1960, a 17-year-old high school student named Otoya Yamaguchi stood alone in his brother's house in the city of Tokyo, Japan, waiting for a tea kettle of water to boil. It was a Wednesday, so Otoya should have been at school, but that day he had gone to school and then snuck out a side door during lunch. More and more often these days, Otoya was feeling like school was kind of meaningless. It was hard for him to sit in history class and watch all of his classmates diligently take notes when, in Otoya's mind, he felt like all the real history was happening outside of the classroom. Just then, the kettle on the stove began to whistle, which meant the water was boiling, and so Otoya grabbed the kettle, he took it off the burner, and he poured it over a tea bag in a cup. And as Otoya began to stir his tea, he began to go over what he was going to do later that day. It was undeniable that Otoya had a very difficult afternoon in store. He had a meeting with a person who was very important, and during this meeting, Otoya would have to deliver some very bad news. In fact, this news was so bad that Otoya had decided what he was going to do was literally write down this bad news and hand deliver it. Now, Otoya had not quite figured out what he was going to write, but he knew whatever it was, it would have to be perfect. For months now, Otoya had been trying to articulate this bad news that was really weighing heavily on him to his peers and to adults and to anybody who would listen, but nobody took Otoya seriously. Adults would look at Otoya and think, oh, that's just some kid, what he's talking about can't be serious, and when Otoya would talk to classmates, they would just kind of laugh at him. Otoya frowned and he looked out the window and he thought to himself, maybe this whole time I've been coming off as too angry when I talk about this bad news. Maybe I need to change the way I talk about it to sound more sincere. And as Otoya was thinking about this, he suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I know exactly what to write. And so Otoya abandoned his tea and ran over to his brother's desk. He grabbed a piece of paper and a pen and he started writing. Over the last year, Otoya had felt like he had really grown up and really started to find his true self. He had been raised in a very strict household. His father was a colonel in the Japanese military, and he expected Otoya to be obedient and polite, and so that was what Otoya had done. But a couple of years earlier, Otoya had managed to secure a spot in a high school in Tokyo, far from where he had grown up, far from his father, and Otoya was really excited. He felt like going to this high school in Tokyo would finally allow him to kind of get out from under his dad's strict authoritarian rule. And his father had let him go to the high school in Tokyo, but after only a couple of weeks, it turned out Otoya's father had decided, nope, I don't want you to go there, and he had insisted that Otoya come back home and go to a Catholic school closer to their hometown. And it was at this point that Otoya, for the first time really in his whole life, he decided to push back against his dad. And so even though Otoya did come home, he did go to this Catholic school, as soon as he was home, he began constantly begging his dad to let him return to Tokyo, let him go back and live with his brother who lived in Tokyo, and let him go to the high school that he loved. And eventually, surprisingly, Otoya's father relented and said, okay, fine, you can go to Tokyo, you can do what you want. And so Otoya had been totally overjoyed. He had returned to Tokyo, gotten re-enrolled in the high school. But after only a couple of months, Otoya had kind of lost interest in the school, and instead his focus had now shifted to politics. Otoya's brother, who Otoya lived with in Tokyo, was very into politics, and he was always taking Otoya to speeches and rallies, and very quickly Otoya had gotten into it. And eventually, Otoya began to think that his purpose in life was in politics, and he just didn't like the idea of having to wait until he graduated from high school to pursue that career ambition. But when Otoya brought these ambitions up to anyone who would listen, no one took him seriously. They looked at him as a skinny, scrawny, kind of meek little guy who was not going to make a difference in the world. But Otoya begged to differ. By now, Otoya was almost done with this note he was writing, and so he looked up and he checked the clock. He saw it was 2 p.m., which meant he really needed to get going soon. He was going to go to a political debate at the Hibiya Public Hall in downtown Tokyo, and the very important person he was going to meet and deliver this bad news to was going to be at this debate. Otoya took one more look down at the note he had just written, and he read it over a couple of times, and he realized he was missing one more line at the bottom. And so he leaned down and he wrote, quote, "I can't forgive you." Feeling like he was done, he folded up the note, put it in his pocket. He stood up, he grabbed his school uniform jacket and put it on, and then he grabbed this package that he had got from his father's house and he put it under his arm, and then he headed out the front door. Otoya always loved the walk downtown. The hall where this debate was going to take place was near the Imperial Palace, and it was this big, imposing building with a terracotta and stone facade that always inspired Otoya every time he saw it. When Otoya arrived at the hall, he saw loads of people streaming in through the front doors for this debate, and so Otoya joined them and made his way inside, and he moved towards the back of the auditorium, and then he began scanning the audience. And he saw there was at least 2,000 people inside, happily chatting and laughing and waiting for this thing to start. But all Otoya could think about was where this person was that he was going to be meeting, because as he was looking around, he didn't see them. At around 2:45 p.m., the moderator of this debate walked up onto the stage down in front. He went to the podium, he grabbed the mic, and he began telling the audience to take their seats and to be quiet, and then he began to explain the rules for this debate. Otoya, at this point, was really only half listening because he was still looking all around the inside of this hall for this person he was going to meet. Where are they? They're not here. 15 minutes later, at around 3 p.m., the moderator left the podium and a new speaker came out on stage. He was a politician named Inajiro Asanuma, and he was the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. But when he began to speak and all the thousands of people in attendance leaned in to listen, Otoya was totally not listening because he could now see the person he was going to meet had arrived. Careful not to cause a disturbance, Otoya moved from the back of the auditorium over to the side of the building, and he began walking up a side aisle, only stopping briefly near a trash can where he pulled out that package he had brought from his father's house, and he unwrapped it and he threw the wrapping away and held on to what was inside of the package. And then Otoya looked down at what he was holding, he took a deep breath, and then he looked up and broke into a run. What happened next was broadcast live on television all across Japan, and by that evening, the footage had gone so viral that it was basically all over the world. A photographer who happened to be in the crowd of people watching this debate also happened to take a very iconic photo of what happened next involving Otoya, and that photo would actually go on to win the Pulitzer Prize in 1961. The Pulitzer Prize is a really big deal. It's the most prestigious award for journalism. It would turn out the very important person that Otoya was supposed to meet inside of this hall during this debate was in fact the speaker on stage at 3 p.m., Inajiro Asanuma, the chairman of the Japan Socialist Party. And the package that Otoya had brought from his father's house to this meeting was a samurai sword. And so after Otoya unwrapped the sword, he took a deep breath and then ran up on stage, charged to the podium, pulled back the sword, and plunged it into Asanuma's torso before he could do anything. And the photographer out in the crowd who would win the Pulitzer happened to snap a photo right as Otoya was pulling the sword out of Asanuma and getting ready to stab him again. Onlookers would immediately rush the stage and tackle Otoya, but the damage was already done. Asanuma would pass away from his injuries within the hour. It would turn out Otoya, ever since moving to Tokyo, had become a radical right-wing ultranationalist. The note that Otoya had carefully penned and then folded up and put in his pocket before carrying out this assassination basically just said that Otoya did not hate Asanuma personally, but Asanuma was slowly transforming Japan into a communist country, and so Otoya could not forgive him for that. And so Otoya decided he needed to act. Otoya was immediately arrested, but 2 weeks later, while he was in prison, he would take his own life. A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, 3 men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Kaz 2 from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Kaz 2 was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months he'd been training for this trip. And the 2 friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All 3 of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination, and where all 3 men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all 3 men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all 3 of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the 3 men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other 2 men laughing in the background, and it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the Kaz 2, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all 3 men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the Kaz 2 to make sure they knew how to do it if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the Kaz 2 before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay when she looked out into the water and she saw the Kaz 2, a white 35-foot catamaran sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants, and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about, at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water, and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on, when details emerged about what happened on the Kaz 2, that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw that boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, 2 more people would spot the Kaz 2. These were 2 men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know Kaz 2. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these 2 men didn't know each other, but independently on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the Kaz 2 sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the Kaz 2 was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the Kaz 2 would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later, but here we were 24 hours later, and 2 more people are seeing the Kaz 2 in the same place that Isabel had seen it, and so that made no sense. But again, these 2 men who saw the Kaz 2, they just saw it and thought nothing of it because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the 2 other men had seen the Kaz 2 on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the Kaz 2. And again, these fishermen do not know the Kaz 2. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing the ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the Kaz 2, they thought something was wrong, because they saw the Kaz 2 from a distance navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the Kaz 2 was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the Kaz 2. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the Kaz 2 with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the Kaz 2 to see if they were okay, but no one from the Kaz 2 called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the Kaz 2, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the Kaz 2 clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine Police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine Police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the Kaz 2, and when they got there, the Kaz 2 was gone. At this point, the Marine Police got some information about the boat, Kaz 2, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the Kaz-2. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the Kaz-2. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water, and from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen, and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water, and then Corey swam by himself over to the Kaz-2 and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck, and right away he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance, minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. But then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat. And as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off. Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job. And so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th. So the day the Kaz set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found. And so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things, like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. On a sunny afternoon in October of 2015, a 39-year-old man named Richard Jones walked along the perimeter of the yard inside of the state prison in Kansas, where Richard was serving time for a robbery. Up ahead, Richard could see there was a small basketball court with one hoop on it, and on the blacktop were dozens of other inmates that were exercising and chatting and socializing, and Richard actually knew most of them because he had been in prison for 16 years now, and Richard was also a very likable guy who was very outgoing and personable, and so he made friends really easily, even in prison. And so as Richard continued his walk in the direction of the basketball court, he saw one of the guys on the blacktop broke free from the group and began moving towards Richard. And Richard immediately recognized who it was. It was his good friend, Steve. And Richard was about to give him a friendly wave when he noticed Steve looked really mad. And so Richard actually just stopped and stared at Steve as he slowly approached him. And as he got closer, Richard could see Steve's fists were balled up and his face was in a scowl. I mean, Steve looked like he was coming over to fight Richard. And so when Steve got about 10 feet away from Richard, Richard actually spoke up before Steve could say anything. And he said, "Steve, what's going on? Why are you so upset?" Steve was kind of a hothead, and Richard knew that. But a lot of times, even when he got mad about things, it would blow over really quickly. And so this was kind of routine, but Richard just couldn't think of a reason for why Steve would be mad at him. And so Steve walks right up to Richard and he goes, "Oh, so now you want to talk to me?" Richard was immediately confused and kind of turned his head sideways and was like, "What?" Steve stared at Richard, kind of expecting Richard to eventually apologize or something, but eventually he noticed that Richard really was not sure what he was talking about. And so Steve was like, "This morning, I went up to you at the cafeteria line, I tried to talk to you, and you completely blew me off and walked away in front of a big group of people. That really embarrassed me and made me look bad." And Richard was like, "I have no idea what you're talking about. I didn't even see you this morning. I don't know where this is coming from." Steve was not buying it, and he was like, "Richard, I know it was you. I saw you this morning. I spoke to you this morning. You did that." And Richard was like, "No, really, Steve, I'm sorry. I have no idea what this is about." And so these two continued to go back and forth on this. And then at some point, they both kind of noticed that they were drawing lots of attention because they are in prison and any sort of confrontation immediately draws eyeballs. And so when they noticed other inmates were kind of beginning to walk over to see what was going on and the guards were starting to notice, Steve just said, "You know what, Richard, fine. I guess I must have made a mistake. No big deal." And he turned and he ran back to the basketball court. After Steve had left, Richard continued his walk around the perimeter, but that exchange with Steve had really weirded him out because this was actually not the first time something like this had happened. It all started a month ago when an inmate that Richard didn't know came up to him like he definitely knew him and said to Richard, "Hey, how's your grandmother? I heard she fell down. Is she okay?" And at first, Richard was like, "Wait a minute, is my grandmother okay? Did she fall?" But then Richard eventually realized that this inmate thought Richard was someone that he wasn't. Now, at first, Richard thought this was just kind of like a weird one-off event, but every few days after this first time, something else would happen. Either an inmate who Richard didn't know would come up to him and be really friendly with him, as if they knew Richard, but Richard clearly didn't know them, or someone Richard did know would come up to him and accuse him of odd behavior that Richard couldn't remember doing, like the interaction he had with Steve when Steve came up and said, "You snubbed me in the lunch line." And so after Richard's interaction with Steve, Richard began to think, wait a minute, is someone screwing with me? Is that what's been going on? The next morning, during breakfast, Richard decided not to sit where he normally did, and instead he sat on the very far side in the corner of the cafeteria to basically just be able to people watch all the people inside the cafeteria. And then that afternoon, when Richard was outside, instead of walking around the perimeter like he liked to do, he just sat in a central location and just constantly scanned the whole yard. Now, Richard didn't really know what he was actually looking for. He just figured, maybe I'll see something suspicious, I'll see someone staring at me for too long, or I'll see someone I don't know talking to my friends. Something will tip me off to what's been going on for the past couple of weeks. But despite all this careful people watching he was doing, Richard didn't see anything suspicious. Until 1 week after the interaction Richard had with Steve about snubbing him in the lunch line, Richard was sitting in the cafeteria again when he noticed something very strange on the other side of the cafeteria. And when he saw it, he just stood up and stared, and he felt his heart starting to race faster, and he felt his breath speeding up, and Steve actually was sitting next to him and said, "Hey, Richard, what's going on?" And Richard couldn't even find the words. He just raised his arm up and pointed to the other side of the room. When Richard had originally been arrested 16 years earlier, it was for robbing someone in a Walmart parking lot. Richard had always claimed he did not do it, but multiple witnesses had pulled Richard out of a lineup saying that's the guy. And the woman who actually got robbed told police she overheard the getaway driver yelling to Rick, the man who had robbed her, to get in the car so they could leave. And Rick is a nickname for Richard. Richard had insisted he was at a barbecue in another state at the time of this robbery, and so it really couldn't have been him, but the evidence was just overwhelming, and so eventually he was convicted. Richard had never been able to understand why so many people 16 years earlier had insisted that he was the one who committed that crime. And more recently, he couldn't understand why his friends, like Steve, were accusing him of doing things that he didn't remember doing. But that night in the jail cafeteria, when Richard spotted something on the other side of the room, suddenly everything over the last 16 years made perfect sense. Richard really was an innocent man. He did not rob that woman in the Walmart parking lot. His doppelganger had. A doppelganger is someone who looks exactly like you, but they're not actually related to you. It's just genetic chance that somebody else on the planet looks just like you. And it just so happened that Richard's doppelganger, who was this man named Ricky Amos, so it just so happened as well that the doppelganger shared basically the same first name, Ricky and Richard. Well, this doppelganger, Ricky, just happened to be sent to the same prison that Richard was at for a totally unrelated crime. These two men have never met. There's no connection whatsoever. They just look the same. And when Richard looked across the cafeteria and saw Ricky, it was like looking at a clone of himself, and it all clicked. All the people that were coming up to him saying, "You were doing this and acting weird." Well, those people, Stephen included, were actually interacting with his doppelganger, Ricky. And 16 years earlier, Ricky was the one who committed that robbery in Walmart, and the victim and the witnesses, they all confused Ricky for Richard. Here are Richard and Ricky's photographs side by side. Once a judge was made aware of this situation and saw the two photos side by side, he knew the police had made a mistake. Even the prosecutor who had tried Richard in the robbery case supported his release. Richard was freed in 2017 and got a $1 million settlement from the state. As for the doppelganger, Ricky Amos, he was never actually tried for the robbery 16 years earlier because by the time they figured out he was the robber, the case was too old to try. On the morning of August 2nd, 2017, two men sat together laughing inside of a bar in a tiny village in northern France. The men were named Lucien Perrault and Olivier Boudin, and even though there was a massive age difference between them, Lucien was 69 years old and Olivier was 38 years old, the two were totally inseparable, to the point where the people in the village referred to them as father and son. Lucien had spent his whole life working in manufacturing in a nearby city, but just 4 years earlier, he had finally retired and he had moved into a small home inside of this northern French village. But when he had first moved into this new home, he had been very lonely and sad. Lucien was divorced, he struggled with alcohol, and he had had a really tough life, and he just wasn't doing well. But when he met Olivier, his whole life turned around. When the two met, Olivier also was kind of like a down on his luck guy. He was struggling with some health issues that made it hard to work, and so for years he had been bouncing between the nearby city and this village in northern France looking for work somewhat unsuccessfully. And so when these two happened to connect, it's like they bonded over having kind of difficult lives. And for Lucien, what really mattered to him was Olivier, despite being so much younger than him, did not treat Lucien like he was this dried up, worthless old man. He treated Lucien like a peer. And so together, these two very unlikely best friends began kind of orchestrating their lives around the other. And before long, it was like their lives had all this new structure and routine and meaning to them, because again, the two men got to be together basically all day long. So, on this particular morning, as Olivier and Lucien were together at this bar, they began talking about what they wanted to do that night. And they settled on having a barbecue at Lucien's house. Lucien would cook up some beef and they would sit out on his back garden patio and just spend the night together. It sounded like a wonderful plan. And in fact, the bartender would say that when Olivier and Lucien finally left the bar that day, that he recalled overhearing them being so excited about this particular barbecue. And so that evening, Olivier and Lucien arrived at Lucien's house, and they went out to the back patio where Lucien had already draped a nice tablecloth over this small round table. It was a red and white checkered patterned tablecloth, and on this table was an open bottle of wine and some cheese and a baguette. And so Olivier, he sat down and began enjoying some wine and bread, and Lucien walked over to the grill and began cooking up the beef. Lucien had a neighbor. We're going to call her Marie because we don't actually know her real name. And Marie's second floor window overlooked Lucien's garden patio where the two men were having this cookout. And so that night, Marie did glance out and saw the two men kind of listening to music and goofing around, and she was used to them spending lots of time together, and she was also used to them staying up late at night. And so she figured, tonight's going to be another one of those nights where these guys are up late, having wine, celebrating, whatever. She was just going to shut the window and try to ignore the noise coming in and just let them do their thing. And so eventually Marie would do that. She would go to bed to the sound of music coming from next door and the sound of men talking. And then the next morning, when Marie got up around 6 a.m., she looked out that window again and frankly was not that shocked at what she saw. Lucien was still just sitting at the table, looking like he could be eating some bread or still drinking wine, and Olivier had clearly passed out on the ground. Now, Marie didn't judge. She knew these two liked to stay up late and drink and do stuff like this, and so she thought, you know what? None of my business. Then at 9 a.m., so 3 hours after Marie had first woken up, she left her house to go to another neighbor's house to feed their chickens while they were away for the day. As she passed by Lucien's house, she glanced into his back garden patio, and she saw Lucien was still just sitting at the table, and Olivier was still passed out on the ground. It was like they hadn't moved for 3 hours. But again, Marie's thinking, none of my business. And so she just kept on going, went to her neighbor's house, and fed the chickens. But when Marie came back to her house 3 hours later, around noon, she looked again into Lucien's backyard, and she saw the two men still had not moved. Lucien is sitting at the table, and Olivier is laying on the ground. And suddenly Marie's thinking, wait a minute, the sun is high in the sky right now. These guys aren't moving. They're going to get heat stroke. We got to do something about this. And so she yelled out to Olivier and Lucien, but she got no response. And so Marie just walked into Lucien's backyard, and as she got closer and closer to the two men, she realized that they were not moving at all. Like they were not breathing. Something was horribly wrong here. And so Marie, she just turned and ran to another neighbor's house. She told them what was going on, and they got these big pots of water, and they ran back and doused Olivier and Lucien with water, trying to get them to snap out of their drunken stupor. But the two men did not move at all when the water hit them. Clearly, they were dead. The next day, the local prosecutor announced there was going to be an investigation into the two men's deaths, which were being classified as criminal acts. And the prosecutor also said that it seemed like Lucien and Olivier died at the same time, and so most likely this was either a double homicide or a murder-suicide, and the primary theory as to what killed the two men was poison put in their food. And so police sent off the canned beans the two men were eating to this institution in Paris to test it for something called botulism, which is a deadly toxin that will grow inside of canned foods, but it came back negative. And then also police sent off the rest of the food the two men were eating to various other laboratories to be tested for poisons. And again, all of it came back negative. There was nothing that the police could detect in any of the food they ate. And so police were kind of confused for a minute, but then the autopsies came back for Olivier and Lucien, and everything changed. Lucien and Olivier were not murdered. This was not a murder-suicide. They didn't die from botulism or from some poison in their food. They died because of a set of very particular circumstances. Both Lucien and Olivier suffered from non-fatal minor medical issues. Lucien had bad dental health and so was missing a couple of teeth, and Olivier was suffering from a heart condition called cardiomegaly, which means his heart was slightly enlarged and somewhat fragile. However, his condition was totally being monitored by doctors and was under control. But just for a second, on the night of August 2nd, 2017, when Lucien and Olivier were having that cookout in Lucien's backyard, their non-fatal minor medical issues suddenly became a really, really big deal. Lucian cooked up a big plate of beef rib. Now, beef rib can be difficult to chew even when you have all your teeth and take your time, but Lucian was missing teeth and he loved this beef rib so much he was wolfing it down really quickly, and so he wasn't chewing it enough, and at some point he swallowed a particularly big unchewed bite and he began to choke. And when that happened, his best buddy, Olivier, sitting across from him, he stood up to try to help his friend who's basically dying right in front of him. And the stress of this moment caused his heart to seize up, his heart which is already enlarged and fragile, and he had a heart attack and died. And then Lucian, who now has no one to help him, continued to sit at the table trying to get this beef out of his throat, but he couldn't, and he eventually asphyxiated and died as well, hunched over at the table. On the evening of March 15th, 2018, a 55-year-old man named Gian stumbled out of this fine dining restaurant in downtown Singapore and promptly threw up on the sidewalk. Pedestrians jumped back to get out of the way, and a woman in high heels and a beautiful fancy dress mumbled something insulting about how drunk Gian must be. But Gian was not drunk. He was totally sober, and now he was absolutely mortified. Gian was actually a businessman who was attempting to impress his clients at dinner, but as he had been sitting at the table with his clients, he had started to feel this pressure in his chest that became so intense that at some point he just had to get up and run outside and vomit. And so after Gian had stood up and wiped his mouth, he thought, now that he had been sick and thrown up, that he would feel better. But as he was standing there, he noticed the pressure in his chest had not been relieved at all. And so, as much as Gian wanted to stick around and talk more with his clients, he felt like the only thing he could do now was to go in and politely excuse himself for the rest of the night and just go home and sleep off whatever was going on with him. But when Gian went back into the restaurant and was actually back at his table, before he could even say a sentence to his clients explaining the situation, he was turning around and running back outside and vomiting on the street again. At this point, Gian knew something was definitely wrong, and so he didn't have time to tell his clients what was going on. He just needed to get to a hospital, and so he sprinted across the street, got in his car, and began driving. When he got to the hospital, he was so scared about what was happening to him that he actually parked his car crooked in the spot and left his door open as he sprinted towards the emergency room. And then once he was inside the hospital, he ran up to the receptionist and tried to tell them what was going on, but he literally couldn't speak, and then he just collapsed in a chair right nearby. Now, the hospital was extremely busy, but all the nurses could tell whatever was going on with this man, it could not wait. And so they ran over to him, they lifted him up, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him into a private exam room. And then once he was in there, they began taking his vitals, and also they began assessing him, looking for some sort of trauma on the outside of his body that could explain what was going on with him, but they couldn't find anything. And so after they were sure that Gian was stable, he was breathing okay, his heart rate was okay, he just couldn't speak, but he was going to be okay, the team decided that the next thing they should do would be to give him a CT scan. A CT scan is a specialized type of imaging that can show what's going on inside someone's body. It's like a really detailed X-ray. And after they gave Gian a CT scan, his results were baffling. There was this solid, fairly large, white object that was lodged at the base of Gian's esophagus. Your esophagus sits below your throat and above your stomach. It's basically the tube that food goes through to get to your stomach. But whatever was stuck inside of Gian's esophagus was not something that looked like food. It actually kind of looked like a human hand. Now, the doctors had no idea what this thing was, and you gotta remember that they really don't have much information here. All they know is this middle-aged guy who's dressed really well has come running into the hospital, he can't speak, and he's collapsed, and here we are. He has this obstruction in his esophagus. And so even though the doctors really had no idea what they were dealing with, what they knew is they had to get this foreign object out of Gian. So they wheeled Gian into the operating room for emergency surgery, and then at some point a doctor came in with this long skinny tube that had a camera at the top of it. Their first step for this operation was putting this camera down into Gian to see what this thing was that was stuck inside of his esophagus. And so after Gian was prepped for surgery, the doctor with this camera began snaking it down Gian's throat until finally the camera could actually see this white object in his esophagus. And when the camera revealed what this thing was, the entire medical team in the operating room just gasped. They could not believe what they were looking at. To understand what they were looking at, we have to go back several hours. That night, Gian had decided he really wanted to impress his wealthy clients. And so he had decided to take them to this very special restaurant that none of them had been to, and he wanted them to try a very special and very rare dish that this restaurant sold. It was called sanakji. Sanakji is a Korean delicacy that is very popular in certain circles. But it's also very dangerous. Every year in South Korea, at least 6 people die from eating sanakji. Because sanakji is just a living octopus. You literally eat the octopus as it's moving around, and the risk of it getting stuck in your throat is pretty high. And so as Gian is trying to eat this living octopus, the octopus decided it didn't want to be eaten, and so it flailed its tentacles around, and finally its suckers lodged onto his esophagus, and that's where it stopped. Now, we don't know how long this octopus remained alive inside of Gian's esophagus, but we know it was alive at least for a little bit, because after Gian managed to swallow it down, it kept wriggling around and grabbing and trying to escape, and that's what created that intense pressure in Gian's chest and kept causing him to go vomit. And so when the doctors put that camera down Gian's throat, they saw a whole octopus. The octopus was removed from Gian's esophagus, and 2 days later, Gian was discharged, fully recovered. It's unclear if Gian ever tried sanakji again.